April 1945. The city that once called itself the heart of an empire was dying. Berlin, once full of light, parades, and the sound of marching boots, had become a wasteland of rubble and smoke. The streets were silent except for the echo of artillery far in the distance. Children played in bomb craters that used to be gardens. Old men carried rifles that shook in their hands. Women stood in line for water at shattered fountains, while the sky rumbled with the thunder of Soviet guns. Posters still clung to the walls. Victory is near. Berlin will stand. But everyone knew it was a lie. The war was lost. The only question left was how it would end. The air smelled of dust, fuel, and fear. Every day, trains full of refugees arrived from the east, or what was left of them. They brought stories of burning villages, of tanks rolling through towns, of the Red Army unstoppable and endless. Inside the city, the last remnants of the German army dug trenches in the parks and turned schools into fortresses. Teenagers of the Hitler Youth patrolled with machine guns too heavy for their shoulders. Old men of the Volkssturm, the People's Army, were ordered to hold the line with rifles from the last war. Berlin must not fall, said the radio. Every man will fight. Every woman will serve. But most people didn't believe it anymore. They just wanted it to be over. At night, the air raid sirens still wailed, though there was nothing left to warn about. The sky glowed orange from fires that never went out. In the basements, families whispered about rumors that Hitler had a secret weapon, that the Allies would turn on the Soviets, that something miraculous would happen. A mother told her children, "Go to sleep. When you wake up, it will be quiet." But she didn't believe it herself. In the Reich chancellery, deep beneath the streets, Adolf Hitler refused to leave the city. He ordered everyone to stay and fight. He promised reinforcements that didn't exist, armies that were already gone. His world had collapsed, but he couldn't see it. Outside the city, the Red Army was closing in from every direction. Marshal Zhukov's forces crossed the Oder, smashing through German lines like paper. Every village between the front and Berlin was burning. From rooftops, Berliners could already hear the low, rhythmic thunder of Soviet artillery, miles away, but getting closer each day. It sounded like the sky was tearing apart, one survivor said. Every boom meant they were one step closer. By mid-April, the first shells began falling on the city itself. Windows shattered, walls crumbled, and people ran for cover. The final act of the war in Europe had begun. Berlin was no longer a capital. It was a ghost. Electricity flickered, food ran out, and the people who remained barely spoke. They waited in silence, listening for the sound that would decide their fate. The sound of tanks. As one man later wrote, "We had lived through 12 years of madness, and now, at last, the nightmare had come home." By mid-April 1945, the thunder at the horizon had become a constant roar. The Soviet guns were no longer miles away, they were at the gates. Every explosion shook the ground like an earthquake. The walls of Berlin trembled, windows fell, and dust filled the air like fog. The people knew the city was surrounded. There would be no escape. Marshal Zhukov's first Belarusian front was advancing from the east. Konev's first Ukrainian front closed in from the south. In the north, Rokossovsky's troops cut off the last rail lines. The Red Army was everywhere. Tanks, artillery, endless columns of men moving through fields of wreckage. By April 21st, Soviet shells were falling in the city center. The sound was deafening, endless, like a storm that would never stop. Inside the city, the German command tried to hold order, but there was no order left. Maps were useless, streets no longer existed, communication lines were cut, whole units vanished without a trace. A German officer wrote in his diary, "We fight for streets that no longer exist. We die for walls that have already fallen." For 12 years, Berlin had been the symbol of power. Torchlight parades, banners, speeches. Now, it was the front line. Every street became a fortress. Every apartment, a bunker. Every intersection, a killing ground. Teenagers of the Hitler Youth crouched behind barricades with Panzerfausts, their faces pale and dirty. Women carried ammunition in baskets once used for bread. The Volkssturm, old men and boys, fought with rifles older than themselves. They weren't soldiers. They were ghosts trying to stop an ocean. A Soviet tank commander later said, "We met no army. We met desperation." Soviet artillery turned the city into fire. Buildings collapsed like sandcastles. Smoke covered the sky so completely that day and night became the same gray blur. From the rooftops, you could see the Spree River reflecting flames. From the streets, you could only see shadows running through smoke. Every step forward cost dozens of lives. The Soviets advanced meter by meter, block by block. Snipers fired from church towers, machine guns echoed from underground tunnels. A Red Army soldier wrote, "The city was alive, but it screamed." Civilians were trapped between two worlds, the collapsing Reich and the advancing Red Army. Some hid in basements, praying the shells would pass them by. Others ran into the open, waving white cloths, hoping someone would see they weren't soldiers. In some neighborhoods, people hung sheets from windows, silent cries for mercy. But the battle didn't stop for anyone. "We no longer knew who was enemy or friend," a Berlin woman said. "There was only noise, dust, and death." By April 25th, Soviet forces had completely surrounded Berlin. The trap was closed. Inside were nearly 2 million people, soldiers, civilians, and those who still believed the end could somehow be avoided. No food, no fuel, no reinforcements. Only the ruins of what once was a city. The Reich was now reduced to a few dozen streets, a handful of fanatics, and a man in a bunker still promising victory that would never come. And outside, the Red Army was waiting, not for orders, but for dawn. While Berlin burned above, deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, the lights were still on. The air smelled of smoke and sweat and fear. Concrete walls dripped with condensation, and the low hum of generators filled the silence between explosions. This was the Führer bunker, the final refuge of a dying empire. Behind thick steel doors, Hitler and his closest followers lived in a world cut off from reality. Maps hung on the walls, marked with red and blue arrows, lines that no longer existed outside. They spoke of divisions that were gone, generals who were dead, victories that had never happened. It was a kingdom of ghosts, commanded by a man who refused to see them. Hitler still gave orders as if the war could be turned around. He screamed at his generals, demanded counterattacks, and moved imaginary troops across the map. He refused to believe that the Red Army was already in the streets above him. "Where is Wenck? He will rescue us," he shouted. "The 12th Army is on its way." But there was no Wenck, no army, no rescue. Every day his world grew smaller, the corridors, the lies, the hope. Around him, life went on, in a way that didn't feel like life at all. Secretaries typed reports no one would read. Guards polished boots that would never march again. Eva Braun smiled at dinners lit by flickering candles, pretending the bombs above were distant thunder. They toasted to victory with cheap champagne while outside children starved in the ruins. One officer later said, "It was like a theater after the audience had left, actors still speaking their lines to an empty hall." Even underground, the fear was suffocating. Everyone knew the end was coming, but no one wanted to be the first to admit it. Every day brought new news, and every piece of it worse than the last. Goebbels' voice echoed through the hallways, promising that Berlin would hold, that the Führer would never abandon his people. But even his eyes had gone empty. Outside the bunker, people whispered that Hitler was gone already, either dead or fled. Inside, he paced from room to room, his hands trembling, his words breaking apart. "Betrayal everywhere," he muttered. "They have all failed me." He no longer spoke of the German people, only of himself. By the end of April, reality could no longer be denied. The Russians were 2 blocks away. The artillery was so close that the bunker shook with every shot. Even the lights flickered. Officers begged him to let the civilians surrender, to save what was left of the city. He refused. "I will not leave Berlin," he said. "Better to fall here than live in defeat." He ordered the remaining soldiers to fight to the last bullet. Some obeyed. Most didn't. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun disappeared into a small room at the end of the corridor. A few minutes later, there was a single gunshot. No one cried. No one spoke. The man who promised a 1,000-year Reich was gone, leaving only ashes behind. Above them, the Red Army advanced through the smoke, unaware that history had just changed, and that the world they were fighting was already dead. Above the bunker, the city was burning. The sky glowed red every night, and the air was thick with ash and smoke. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the stench of fire and decay. Streets that once carried parades now carried the dead. The thunder of artillery never stopped. The ground shook, the walls cracked, and yet people still fought. The Red Army had reached the center of Berlin. Tanks moved slowly through narrow streets filled with rubble and wrecked trams. Snipers fired from church towers. Grenades exploded in stairwells. Every building was a battlefield, every basement a grave. The German defenders were outnumbered, outgunned, and starving. But many refused to surrender. Boys from the Hitler Youth, barely 15, ran through the smoke with Panzerfausts, shouting, "Für Führer und Vaterland," before disappearing in the blast. A Soviet soldier wrote, "They were just children. We didn't want to shoot." But they shot first. Fighting raged around the Reichstag, the heart of what was left of the Reich. It wasn't strategy anymore. It was survival. Machine guns rattled from windows, artillery shells tore buildings apart, and soldiers fought hand to hand in corridors filled with fire and dust. Zhukov's men advanced building by building, room by room, flag by flag. The order was clear: take Berlin, whatever the cost. And the cost was enormous. The Red Army lost thousands in those last few days alone. For them, victory was just a few hundred meters away. But those meters felt endless. "We could see the Reichstag," one soldier said, "but between us and it was hell." In the ruins, civilians hid wherever they could: cellars, subway tunnels, under collapsed bridges. They were starving, terrified, and trapped. For many, the world had already ended. A woman recalled, "The shells came so close that the air turned solid. The walls shook, and the lamps went out. We sat in the dark and waited for the roof to fall." Some tried to flee, carrying white flags, but there was nowhere to go. The city was surrounded, the exits gone, and the sound of battle came from every direction. For most, surrender wasn't a choice. It was a prayer. Soviet soldiers moved like ghosts through the ruins, exhausted, covered in dust, eyes hollow from weeks of fighting. They had come all the way from Stalingrad, Kursk, and the frozen fields of the east. They had lost too many to count. Now they were here, at the gates of the enemy's capital. But victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like the end of something too big to understand. One officer later said, "We fought for revenge, but when we got it, we only felt tired." On April 30th, as Hitler's body cooled in the bunker below, Soviet troops stormed the Reichstag. They climbed through windows, fought across marble staircases, and planted red flags on every floor. By nightfall, the building was a skeleton of fire and stone. At dawn, a flag waved from the rooftop, the red banner over Berlin. Soldiers stood in silence, staring at it. No cheering, no celebration, only the sound of wind moving through smoke. They had won, but the city around them was dead. By May 1st, Berlin had stopped fighting, at least most of it. The guns still echoed here and there, but it was no longer war. It was chaos. A dying empire breathing its last. The radio that once promised victory now played only static. The flags had been torn down, the streets were filled with smoke, and the smell of burning fuel drifted through the ruins. And deep underground, the word everyone had been waiting for finally came. The Führer is dead. When the message spread through the bunkers and tunnels, some refused to believe it. Others wept, not for him, but for themselves, because now there was no one left to tell them what to do. For years they had lived in blind obedience. Now there was only emptiness. One officer whispered, "It's over." But no one knew what over meant anymore. In some corners, fanatics still fought, refusing to surrender. In others, soldiers threw away their weapons and walked out into the open with hands raised. The Reich was collapsing street by street, heartbeat by heartbeat. Goebbels tried to continue the illusion. He spoke on the radio one last time, calling for resistance, for loyalty. But even he knew it was done. Within hours, he and his family were gone too. Another promise turned to dust. The bunker was silent now. Only the hum of the generators remained, echoing through empty corridors. The empire that once ruled half of Europe had ended not with a speech, but with a whisper. On May 2nd, the last German units in Berlin laid down their arms. Columns of soldiers emerged from the smoke, pale, starving, eyes hollow, hands trembling. They looked less like an army and more like ghosts. A Soviet commander described the moment. They came out quietly. No one spoke. They walked as if the ground itself was ashamed. Some carried makeshift white flags, torn shirts, bed sheets, even tablecloths. Others simply dropped their rifles in the mud and stared at the ground. The Red Army soldiers didn't cheer. They just watched. The victory was too heavy to celebrate. Everywhere, the cost of the war was visible. Bodies lay in the open, horses frozen in the streets, buildings burned to the foundations. The Spree River carried ashes downstream. In the Tiergarten, once a park of beauty and statues, only blackened trees remained, and silence. A Soviet soldier wrote, "We thought the war would end with joy. It ended with nothing." The civilians emerged slowly, blinking in the light for the first time in weeks. Women, children, old men, carrying what little they had left. Some knelt beside the bodies of loved ones. Others just walked without direction. A Red Army nurse recalled, "They didn't look like enemies anymore. They looked like us." The war had turned everyone into survivors. Nothing more, nothing less. At noon on May 2nd, a final red banner rose above the ruins of the Reich Chancellery. It fluttered weakly in the wind, above a city that no longer had a name, only a memory. Below it, Soviet soldiers stood in silence, staring at what was left. One of them whispered, "This is not victory. This is the end of the world." And in that silence, the guns finally stopped. When the last gun fell silent, no one cheered. There were no parades, no music, no speeches, only the echo of wind moving through the ruins of Berlin, the capital of a world that no longer existed. Smoke drifted above the city for days, rising like ghosts that refused to leave. The smell of ash and dust clung to everything: clothes, hair, even the air. The fires burned on, as if the earth itself was trying to forget what had happened. From the basements, the survivors emerged, slowly, carefully, as if the daylight might hurt them. Women carried children wrapped in blankets made from curtains. Old men limped with makeshift canes. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow. They didn't speak. There were no words left. A Soviet soldier wrote, "When they came out, we didn't see enemies. We saw people who had lived through hell. Some shared bread, some shared silence. And for the first time in years, no one gave orders." The men who had marched from Stalingrad through Kursk, Warsaw, and the endless fields of death were finally still. They sat on the steps of ruined buildings, smoking in silence, staring at the horizon. They had won. But victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion and grief. "We had reached the heart of the beast," one soldier said, "and found only ashes." They thought about home, about the faces they hadn't seen in years, about the friends buried in foreign soil, about what it would mean to live again. Berlin was unrecognizable. Entire districts were gone, replaced by seas of bricks and broken glass. The streets were filled with burned-out vehicles, twisted rails, fallen statues. In some areas, the silence was so complete that even birds avoided it. The Spree River carried debris downstream: helmets, rifles, papers, the fragments of a city that once ruled half the continent. A nurse who walked through the ruins later said, "It felt like walking through the end of the world." Historians would later count the numbers: millions dead, cities erased, nations scarred. But no number could capture the truth of what remained. In the ruins of Berlin, a Soviet soldier handed a child a piece of chocolate. The boy took it, stared for a moment, and began to cry. Not from fear, but because it was the first act of kindness he had seen in years. It was small, but it meant everything. As spring came, flowers began to bloom through the cracks in the streets. The fires went out. The air grew warmer. And for the first time in 6 years, Europe began to breathe again. In the distance, the bells of a church rang, faint, broken, but real. The war was over. Berlin had fallen. But in its ruins, humanity had somehow survived. "We buried the dead," one woman wrote. "And then we began to live." The world changed forever in those days of April and May 1945. Empires ended, borders shifted, but the memory of Berlin, the fire, the fear, the silence, remained. It became a reminder that no matter how high hatred rises, it will always fall to the ground. And when the dust settles, the only thing left standing is the will to live.